Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. The digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode discusses the future of home diagnostic testing, featuring Linda Malek, a partner at Moses and Singer, and Marisa Cruz from Everly Health.
All right, I have 9:01. We'll get started. The person that really needs another sip of her coffee is our guest, Marisa Cruz, who's joining us from California, and Linda Malek for joining us from New York. So, Linda, we expect you've already had your coffee, but at least one cup of coffee. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Hawks Bland, the CEO at New York Bio, and we're very happy that you're joining us for another edition of our virtual breakfast series. Thank you to our partners at Moses and Singer for sponsoring this week's discussion. We have Marisa Cruz from Everly Health and Linda Malek, a partner at Moses and Singer, and we're going to talk testing, all kinds of testing today, not just COVID testing, right? And diagnostics and the regulatory environment around those. So we're really looking forward to digging in. As always, a housekeeping measure. Please ask your questions. We want to hear from you, but we'd like for you to put those questions in either the chat or the Q&A box. So just do that, and then throughout the conversation, Derek and I will get to those questions and pose them to our guests today. With that, I'll turn it over to Derek to kick off the discussion. Thanks, everybody.
All right, good morning. Thank you so much, Jennifer. So Marisa and Linda, it's so great to have both of you here. We usually start off with a bit of an origin story, but why don't we do maybe a slight lightning round? So maybe Marisa, you can tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to Everly. And then Linda, we can follow with you for kind of a little background and context on some of the folks that you work with and some of the things you're seeing in the testing industry. So Marisa, why don't you go first?
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Marisa Cruz. I'm the Executive Vice President for Regulatory and Clinical Affairs at Everly Health. Everly Health is a company focused on at-home diagnostic testing, as well as we've recently expanded to offer a US-wide clinician network and telehealth support for a variety of testing modalities. I am a physician by training. I'm an internist and endocrinologist, and I came to Everly Health through a series of career twists and turns. I've spent time in academia. I've spent time in government, most notably at FDA, at the Centers for Radiological Devices and Health, CDRH, focused on digital health policy development and implementation. And then joined Everly Health early in 2021, really interested in getting a unique perspective on the at-home access to diagnostic space, really interested in a company that was very focused on dimensions of price transparency, affordability, accessibility that I care very much about and have touched on many times in my course as a practicing physician.
Okay, and Linda, how about we go over to you?
Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Jennifer, for having me here as well. And I'm looking forward to talking with you and Marisa today. As you said, I'm a partner at Moses and Singer, and I started my career also in government, but in city government, working on healthcare policy and legislation, and then switched over to private practice where I work with a variety of different kinds of entities, including biotech companies, life sciences companies, health tech, and institutional providers as well. And it's been a really interesting last few years, I would say, in terms of what the regulatory environment looks like and how it has expanded to try to keep up with the advances in technology, because that's always the challenge as a lawyer, is to advise clients on what to do when the law doesn't seem to keep up. And it's been really interesting during this past year and a half with COVID, because I think what we're seeing both at the federal level and at the state levels across the states is a real effort to try to expand opportunities for the kinds of things that Everly Health is doing, for example, in terms of at-home testing, mobile testing, expansion in the context of what labs can do, lots of expansion too, though, in terms of trying to protect privacy in a variety of areas. California just came out with particular laws about genetic testing, for example, once we talk about things beyond COVID. So it's a really dynamic regulatory environment right now, which has been super interesting.
Yeah. So if we can give a little context, why don't we kind of wind the clock back a little bit? Because I think the context of most people is through COVID testing, really. I think that's the thing that's been in most people's mind about the thing they would like to test for at home. Now you can actually kind of get the Binax or other kits from either CVS or just your local drugstore. But, for context, this idea really isn't all that new. And it'd be interesting to think about how we got where we are. So what were some of the things, if we go back, what were some of the early developments that made any sort of mobilized testing or home testing possible? So Marisa, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah, I would be happy to. I do think to your point that there has been access to at-home testing for some time, but the regulatory landscape and the complexity of this environment, I think, has changed significantly over the last decade or so. Obviously, we've had at-home pregnancy tests, fairly simple assays that have been available to consumers for decades, really. But I think we've seen a number of advances in the types of diagnostic testing, in the breadth of outreach to different types of patients over recent years. So from a regulatory perspective, I think there has been advances in FDA's position as well as state regulatory positions on telehealth as a type of diagnostic assay, on the access to either at-home sample collection or actually point of care rapid testing. And I think that the agency, at least from an FDA perspective, is still articulating a full stance on that. We can talk a little bit about where we think there might be some shifts in the regulatory landscape around those types of testing modalities moving forward. And then I think over the past couple of years, we've obviously also seen a significant uptick in wearables and mobile diagnostic testing. Exactly, yes.
My Oura Ring is charging.
Almost a quarter of US adults now in America have access to or regularly use a type of wearable technology. And so I think access to those types of technologies has also spurred a variety of conversations around appropriate regulatory pathways for them. And I think we've seen FDA come out with a series of diagnostic guidance documents over the past couple of years, talking about mobile medical applications, software as a medical device. I think we'll talk in more detail later in this conversation, but really articulating some of the cybersecurity and data protection elements that go hand in hand with more widespread mobile diagnostic testing and wearables in particular. So I think that there has been sort of a set of evolutions in the regulatory landscape that kind of went, again, sort of hand in hand with the expansion and complexity of the testing that we're talking about. Again, moving from fairly simple, biochemical assays through to a more technology-driven, complex preventive screening landscape that encompasses a number of diagnostic testing.
Yeah. So in your mind, what are some of the, kind of technological milestones that allowed this to happen, either in assay development or anything else? Because at some point it had to be, both feasible and easier in some respects to actually reach people in their kitchen, rather than having, a sample, sent to LabCorp and come back and read it and kind of into that doctor loop. What are some of the things that made this, possible, or, got to the point where it was going to be attractive for people at home?
So I think that there's a number of advances that have really contributed to the current state. I think obviously we have had some advances in testing constructs that have allowed for longer stability windows, that we can have mail-in testing and, accurate and appropriate diagnostic testing that's done at a lab through, rapid shipping, again, enhanced stability windows and new types of assay development. I think when we then talk more about some of these more technology enabled testing modalities, we're talking more about sensors, right? That we've allowed for, or we've enabled increasingly small personal sensors that have come in at a lower price point, are more accessible to the consumer. And I think that that has really driven a lot of the development around, the explosion in devices like continuous glucose monitors, at home monitoring of blood pressure, sleep. There's a variety of factors that people are very interested in knowing about, either from a fitness perspective or from a preventive and healthcare perspective. And I think the development of technologies that are really oriented to consumers are, again, accessible at a consumer price point and can be inputs into increasingly complex algorithms that allow people to have greater insight into their either potentially new health conditions or for remote monitoring of existing conditions. I think that those have been some of the enablements over recent years that have driven this advance.
Yeah, I actually want to come back. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, one thing I had noticed a few months ago is the proliferation of, you mentioned the continuous glucose monitor, right? Of that being available, not for diabetes or, blood sugar monitoring for people with diabetes, but for this sort of, I'll call it fitness, general health, right? It seems like now there's so many companies that are out there offering that, and it comes with the app. And I did it for 2 weeks and it was fascinating, right? And I think part of it is having people understand that these things are out there and getting them to realize they can take advantage of them, which I don't think I would have ever thought about that. I would have thought, oh no, that is only for someone if they have diabetes and their doctor recommends it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think it does speak to this a bit of a gray zone in terms of the regulatory landscape for some of these new products, which are really pushing the envelope into, what I have called in previous positions kind of population level screening, right? These aren't for people with necessarily diagnosed conditions, but they're for people who have family risk factors, personal risk factors to develop a certain condition. They're people who just want to have more information about their healthcare state and their healthcare journey. And I think industry and regulatory agencies are really grappling with exactly how to think about these kinds of products, right? Where do they fit into the regulatory landscape? Are they making clear diagnostic or preventive claims, which would move them into a medical device territory? Are they purely fitness and, sort of informational, educational? Yes, exactly. Offerings. And so I think it's a really interesting space. I definitely agree with you.
Yeah, I would love to dig more into the gray area. So Linda, with your experience here, have you seen the general kind of knowledge base of the companies that you're working with kind of increase over the years? Do you think people have pretty much a good idea of what they want to do, how they reach their customer, what their product, what their kind of data package should look like? And do you think kind of the general company is a little further ahead of where it was, say, even 5 years ago? Because this is such an emerging field.
I wouldn't say that there is sort of a clear path that companies see, because to Marisa and Jennifer's points earlier, there is a real gray area, and it poses a challenge from both a regulatory standpoint as well as, I think, from a business standpoint, because so many of these technologies and applications can have multitudes of uses. which road you take, which path you take, how you're going to convey that to the consumer, what you're going to advertise it as doing, and who is going to interact with it are all really important questions to make sure that you have answers to before you move forward. For example, in the glucose blood monitoring space, what you were talking about, Jennifer, can absolutely be used in sort of a wellness context. And the FDA looks at, in terms of its regulation, is this application really to be used for health and wellness, or is it really to be used for diagnostic purposes? And so when you get into something like that, sometimes you have an application that could be used for both, and that could be really useful actually for a physician to have it as a tool for remote monitoring of a patient. And that's where I think you run into lots of questions around, well, how can we be transparent about this as a company? Which direction do we want to go? How do we interact with FDA? So I think that, Derek, to your question, there are a lot of roads to navigate for companies, because there are lots of opportunities, but at the same time, both from an FDA perspective and also from an FTC perspective, because the FTC is really looking at, what do consumers understand about this product?
Mm-hmm.
How are you explaining this to them? And, as Marisa touched on, we'll get into privacy and cybersecurity issues perhaps a little bit more, but what are you doing with this information? So you've got the threshold issue in terms of, what does this thing do? And how are we going to market it? And how are we going to interact, if at all, with FDA on it? And then the second thing is, how clear is the consumer as to what the purpose of it is, as well as how this information that I'm inputting is going to be used. So I think there are lots of different things to navigate for companies. They've advanced a lot in the last 5 years, but there are a lot of new questions.
I would also add to the gray area where, there's basically a triangle here, and you have another set of stakeholders where you're actually giving, if we're thinking about either a watch or a health monitor or something like it, you're giving a health monitor to a person who is then going to hopefully discuss that data with their doctor. Right. And this is a completely, you haven't sold this thing to a doctor. The doctor has been completely outside of this communication loop in a de novo sense. So now you actually have to have either the caregivers or the providers or your doctors both understand what you're doing, digest that data, and figure out if the data is any good, and then actually do something with it from a health perspective, which I think is one of the hardest things to think about in this context.
Yeah, but I also think we have to remember that for a portion, and this is, I think, where Linda was talking about, who is your end user, and what are they planning to do with it, right? Because that determines whether you are seeking approval as a medical device, or whether this is, something sort of general health, not intended to diagnose or treat a medical condition, right? And then do those people, do they have a physician, or is this in some ways acting as sort of an interstep between the test result may help them determine whether to seek medical care based on what those tests, whatever test they're choosing, maybe then they seek medical care. I mean, you go back years to the beginning of sort of at-home pregnancy test that enabled women to sort of confirm first at home before they, made the appointment, right? And so that I see that same progression with even more, maybe not complicated, it didn't get much more complicated, right? But, a broader swath of diagnostic options.
Marisa, maybe you can give us a little context here just from Everly's perspective. So can you tell us a little bit about, the tests that Everly offers and how Everly has kind of managed some of these issues from a regulatory standpoint? I think you guys are a really good case study for this.
Of course. So Everly Health offers access to a variety of at-home based test kits, and they span a range of clinical domains. So we have a suite of tests that are focused on infectious disease, sexually transmitted infections, COVID, Lyme disease, We have a number of tests that fall into more of a cardiometabolic preventive category, sort of our classic A1C for type 2 diabetes, cholesterol and lipids, heart health. And then we also offer several tests, a number of products that focus more on hormonal profiles. So thinking about fertility, supporting women from a preconception through pregnancy and then premenopause state, and giving them information about those different stages of their life journey.
Okay.
So from a regulatory perspective, the vast majority of the assays that we offer access to fall into the laboratory developed test space. And that's a really interesting dimension of the regulatory environment as well. I think, as this audience knows, there are over 100,000 laboratory developed tests being actively marketed in the US. And the definition of what is a laboratory developed test, the way people are thinking about regulation of these tests has evolved over time. So at the moment, all of our tests are regulated through the CLIA and CAP CMS-based regulatory framework. And that's been in place, obviously, for a number of decades. It requires regular assessment. It requires demonstrated evidence of analytical validity for the tests that we offer. But there has been, I think people have followed the back and forth from an HHS and FDA and congressional perspective on whether that's the right framework and whether there needs to be any additional regulatory oversight, particularly for more complex assays, right? So, and again, the Everly Health model, we are providing access to relatively straightforward, well-accepted clinical practice of medicine type of test, right? That there's a clear role in the ecosystem for regular periodic screening of things like A1C and cholesterol and lipids. There are clinical practice guidelines that articulate how to interpret those test results, when to seek additional care, et cetera. There are clearly tests that move towards a much more complicated side of the spectrum in terms of genetic testing, liquid biopsies that really are probably outside the scope of what were initially envisioned to be within the realm of laboratory developed tests. And so you may have followed that there are several competing proposed pieces of legislation in Congress right now, which are really thinking about different directions of that regulatory framework, whether they should solidly be outside of scope for an agency like FDA, or again, sort of the diametrically opposed position that they should be squarely within FDA jurisdiction, and that there should be a risk-based framework that provides more targeted regulatory oversight from a pre-market perspective.
Are you suggesting that members of Congress have divergent views on how to address the same issue, Marisa?
It happens occasionally.
We have kicked people off this program for less, Marisa. With that in mind, so Linda, how do you talk to clients about the regulatory landscape? How do you talk to them about their approach to this? What in general, what are some of the things that you think about as guideposts? Say if you have either a new client, somebody that hasn't hit the market, is thinking about going to market, what are some of the things that you kind of make sure they think about and make sure they go through before launching? And do you kind of give them the expectation that this is the way things are now, but they may change?
Yeah, that's actually, that last bit is sort of my mantra. This is maybe the way things are now, but they're going to change. I really try to approach things in terms of forward thinking, best practices approaches. And so when I'm counseling clients in areas that are still in flux, as this area really is, I really try to get them to think about, what would the best practice be in the industry in terms of this space. So even though you could do X or Y, these laws are influx right now. There's a lot of debate around them. If they go, a particular way, you're going to have to completely redo your business model. You're going to have to completely retrench in terms of how you're interacting with consumers now. You're going to potentially have to, for example, reconsent people in order to use the information that you want to use down the line. So try to think in terms of, big picture, a few years down the line, and build this with best practices in mind. So really, one thing that I've found interesting is that across the board, companies don't always think about state laws. And what we see over and over again is that as Congress is fighting about whatever the issue is from a regulatory standpoint, the states are stepping in to try to fill the gaps. And there's a patchwork of law that has developed in a number of different areas that touch on companies that are doing things like at-home tests, or that are doing things like lab developed tests in new areas. And so the question becomes, what is an attorney general from a particular state going to care about in terms of what you're doing? And so looking at that, what are the most stringent states? What would the best practice be if you're going to be operating across the country? So those are the kinds of things that I try to work with clients to think about, so that the legal and regulatory environment is not viewed as an impediment. It's not viewed as a sort of cost drain for the company, but rather it's really viewed as an opportunity to think in terms of how can we structure this so that we're really going to be in good shape and on solid footing going forward, so that as the laws change, we don't need to completely recalibrate.
Can I ask about one other piece? So we've talked about the regulatory landscape of these tests even being made available, right, to the public, and how they're made available. What about paying for the test and whether or not, insurance will cover, reimburse? Is that dependent on the path a company takes as far as how they seek regulatory approval for products like home testing?
Yeah, I'll offer my perspective, and then would love to have Linda jump in. But yes, the regulatory, or rather the reimbursement landscape here is also somewhat murky, right? And depends a little bit on the type of assay that we're discussing.
Okay.
For Everly Health, we have to date focused mostly on a self-pay model because we've been really interested in those touch points that I mentioned at the outset of price transparency and affordability, right? That we recognize with reimbursement, although it may lower out-of-pocket costs, there is, a lack of transparency, certainly, and a history of some surprise billing sometimes with reimbursement models that can be challenging and frustrating for a consumer to have to navigate. However, we are thinking about the reimbursement space, and I think many other companies similarly situated are as well. And I think, yes, there are some questions about what reimbursement will look like. I think for traditional laboratory tests where there is a physician evaluation and management that revolve around those test results, there's a clear reimbursement pathway. I think models where access to lab testing is provided, again, more for informational purposes or outside of sort of a hospital traditional clinic-based model, it can be less certain as to what the reimbursement framework will look like. When you talk then moving away from laboratory assays into some of those other technologies that we discussed, software as a medical device, wearables, et cetera, I think we get even more fuzzy, right? That there are, in some cases, payers have set up these relatively new kind of digital formularies and are thinking about different models of reimbursement or, sort of cost offsets for users who want to participate in programs that that offer these technologies. But I think there's still very little clarity from a CMS perspective, from an FDA perspective, and from a private payer perspective on exactly how to map out the offering that you're developing, the product that you're developing to a reimbursement path.
Yep.
Yeah, and I can jump in there a little bit
Go ahead,
in terms of that piece. And we work with clients with some frequency that are trying to obtain reimbursement for test. And as Marisa said, it's challenging because, without getting too much in the weeds, you have to come up with a strategy first of all, in terms of how do you want to try to pursue reimbursement, whether it's through first seeking approval from CMS Central or the state regional directors, and then the state Medicaid programs, which is a whole other thing, and then commercial insurers. So, in what order do you take that, first of all? And then secondly, what is the reimbursement structure going to look like? Because some of these technologies don't fit easily into an existing CPT code.
Yep.
And that's usually the easiest path, is to try to fit your technology into something that is already familiar to both regulators and insurers. But in other instances, because of the nature of the technology, there is no code available. There's no code that really fits. And so how difficult is it then to create a new code and to get approval for that? So that pathway is one that differs, depending on what the technology is.
Right. And you also have, in different states, you have, like New York has almost a third of our population, which accesses the Medicaid program, right? Because we have broad expansion of Medicaid availability, but other states, it's very, it's much smaller. So I think then your strategy, on a state by state basis could almost be overwhelming, right? Particularly a company that doesn't have tons of, or is still developing a lot of their tests for the market.
Right. And I think we are seeing a lot of smaller stage startup companies with really innovative ideas who are getting hung up at that point, right? I've figured out my product. I figured out how to engage with consumers. I've started to forge, down the path of figuring out whether I'm regulated, how I'm regulated, but then, that doesn't actually, it only gets me 50% of the way there. If I can't figure out how to commercialize, I can't figure out how to pay for it.
Right.
Talking about consumers, right? So I think we've had a paradigm shift over the last, 20 months with consumers being aware of testing in ways that they weren't, right? I think before, you knew you went, maybe you got your blood work done like once a year, assuming you were, generally healthy. But then all of a sudden, we've been testing. I mean, like Derek said, I have Binex tests, for COVID, and we did the drive-through probably 20 times here in New York. We test all the time. And so so before, I think it was probably getting consumers comfortable with this idea of it being a valid, right, test to be able to do at home. Now, are you finding that consumers want to test for just many more things at home now that they're comfortable with this idea? Or how has COVID changed that approach from a consumer perspective?
Yeah, I think we have seen a significant uptick in interest in home-based testing across the board. And I do think that COVID has played a significant role in, as you said, Jennifer, raising awareness, and then raising comfort with the idea of doing testing at home, interacting with online results platforms, figuring out a modality to communicate your test results to your physician and talk about next steps. So I think the whole construct is one that has definitely been accelerated by COVID, but I think will outlast COVID. I think that consumers have recognized that there are elements of sort of ease of use and autonomy in being able to do some at-home testing that are, sort of that will stick with us, right? That will remain elements of the healthcare ecosystem, I think, for many years. I think every patient will tell you about I'm sure everyone on this call has had the experience of having to take the day off, to take a sick child to be evaluated, and then having to take another couple of hours to then go to the separate lab and, make sure that we get the right phlebotomy, and then figuring out how to then come back with the test results and connect with the physician again and figure out what to do. And I think the pain points in that model are being addressed and eased by at-home based collection or point of care testing in ways that are very meaningful and I think disruptive in a positive direction for the healthcare system.
So to keep going on that, just from a patient perspective, what are some of the areas that you think either will be or maybe should be kind of best addressed by this kind of testing? What are some of the patient groups that should look at this and actually say that, yeah, barriers are breaking down here. This kind of testing is actually going to be easier for us. It's actually going to be really valuable in terms of managing our health and managing our conditions.
So I think that there are a couple different categories of consumers who are really benefiting from this model. I do think, again, to Jennifer's point, sort of people who are generally healthy but want information that is not otherwise sort of easily accessible about their health status. Again, people who have potential family risk factors, they're not feeling symptomatic, they don't have any diagnosed conditions, but they want to make sure that they're staying abreast of their health conditions and their health information. I think that category of consumers will benefit significantly from the ability to have more readily accessible test results. I think there is an emerging group of consumers who do have diagnosed medical conditions where remote monitoring is playing an important part of keeping people healthy at home, right? And trying to keep people out of more acute clinical settings in the interest of being able to, allow people to be in the comfort of their home. There's obviously cost savings to that. I think there's better clinical outcomes that have been demonstrated in many scenarios. So I think remote monitoring for people with diagnosed conditions is another population. And then I think the jury's still out, but my sense is that there will be a real benefit to older consumers as well, that there's a population of older consumers, the elderly, who have an interest in aging in place, who will really see a benefit from the advent of wearables that enable hearing amplification, fall detection, again, some of those remote monitoring capabilities, companion diagnostics that allow for medication titration. I think there's a lot that can be offered in the home that I think seniors would really benefit from.
Yeah, and there's also there's an entire segment of the industry that is aimed at helping caregivers and family members stay connected to elderly relatives and be a part of their care. So there's also an entire suite of either enabling or supplemental technologies that you have this additional technological support, if you will, and the testing and the information and the other elements of health really kind of follow on to that. It's all kind of pieces of the puzzle. You could almost flip it around and think about it. You mentioned kids before. It's really the same way with your children, right? You think about the health of the family unit, and how does the way that you approach healthcare impact how do you get to the doctor's office? How do you have time to get your kids where they need to be? And for a lot of populations, it's incredibly important.
That brings me to something that Derek and Marissa, you said, and Linda, it has a regulatory component. What about a third category? What about physicians and being able to utilize having, let's just throw out, we'll stay with the peds, right? Example. What if an at-home strep test, right, was available, right? And you instead of your pediatrician would say, okay, this is what I recommend. Do you do this test? And then if it's positive, then you call and we'll call in, right, the antibiotics. But obviously there's a scope of practice issue, there's reimbursement. I mean, how do we get to the point where something like that might be appropriate and available in the marketplace?
Well, I guess I can jump in. I think it's a really important set of considerations. I think that what many companies in this space are trying to do is that sort of easing of friction points that we mentioned a few minutes ago. And I think the one thing we don't want to end up with is like even more fragmented care, because people are just providing, one element of care that is not connected into a broader care delivery model, healthcare ecosystem. And I think figuring out that hook back into connection with a clinician is essential to prevent that from happening, right? That fragmentation from happening. And I think it is a bit challenging for providers to navigate the sort of flurry of whether it be wearable data, whether it be online platforms that allow for consumers to track and trend, test results over time, or, vital parameters, blood pressure, et cetera. I think figuring out how to make sure that the data that's being transmitted is interpretable and actionable, and to give providers confidence in the test modality itself, right? Again, we talked about like, if we're not certain on the regulatory pathway, we're not certain on the reimbursement pathway, it's hard to give providers a sense of confidence that these are tools I can know and trust and reliably take action on. And so I think we're sort of all pointed in the direction, but I think there's still much more work to do to make sure that there is that kind of curated set of tools that really make sense in a provider's toolkit, and allows them to make clinical decisions without really disrupting in a negative way their typical pattern of practice.
So Linda, how would you advise a client that said, we want we want this to be our end model, right? Where it's both collaborative with providers, but yet available to consumers. You've almost got a combination of both. I'm your most difficult client, and I want it all.
Yeah, as I'm listening to both of you talk about this, there are a few things that occur to me. One is that really up until now, these types of technologies where the desire is for a physician to incorporate them into her practice are technologies that we would advise clients to interface with the physician community as well. So even though you have a tool that can be sold directly to consumers, as Marisa said, if the desire is to also have physicians utilize them, you're going to want to have some critical mass of physicians actually interfacing with these, and perhaps even suggesting to their patients that they use it. And to do that, you would need to partner with the physicians. And in partnering with the physicians or with health systems, for example, there are certain things that they need to feel comfortable with. They need to feel comfortable that, as Marisa said, the technology is reliable and is at the same standard as what they're used to in terms of sending a test out to a lab.
Yeah.
Or in the case of, say, a rapid strep test, what they would use in the office to do at least the initial rapid test. Mm-hmm. So there's that piece of it. And then secondly, it goes back to, the privacy and security aspects. What are you doing with this information? So we, hospital, health system, physicians, we have to have assurances that if we're going to be sharing our patients' information with you through this technology, that you're going to protect it in the same way that we would protect it. So there's that aspect as well. And then lastly, and we haven't really touched on this, but HHS, I think, is moving toward the idea that patients are increasingly really involved in their own care. And the information blocking rules, I think, are a pretty strong statement to that effect. Because if what you're doing is saying, when a result comes in, the patient has the right to access it at the same time as the clinician does. That sort of opens the door, I think, even further for these types of collaborations that we're talking about, where a patient may be using a test at home, getting the results, sharing them with the physician, vice versa, at the same time. So so what I would advise is kind of along the lines of what I said, collaborating with the provider community, but understanding that the regulatory environment is really moving in that direction too.
Yeah. And that New York is the only state that you can't currently purchase Everly Health test, correct?
That is true. Yes. Again, as Linda pointed out, state frameworks in lab regulation do provide some complexity. So New York is currently the one we don't.
For the moment.
For the moment, exactly.
So Linda, first of all, congratulations, because you actually gave the best answer to the question that I was going to ask, which was literally about how trust answers into this. So I'm not going to ask that question. Instead, I would go to the question we have from the audience, which is, in general, when you think about your minimum viable product, in terms of cost, accuracy, or speed versus the gold standard, what kind of claims do you think there are that set off FDA scrutiny? So from a regulatory standpoint, what are the kind of things that the regulators see as red flags?
Well, if we're talking, and I'll let Marisa jump in on this too, based on her experience, but if we're talking about FDA in particular, then it's some of the things that we were discussing earlier as to whether you're claiming that your technology has a diagnostic component to it, that it can be used by physicians for treatment purposes. Those kinds of things will all trigger FDA scrutiny. Anything that gets close to that line will also trigger FDA scrutiny. If you're really squarely in the health and wellness category that is not related to treatment, diagnosis, monitoring of a condition, those kinds of things, at least pursuant to current FDA guidance, would fall outside of FDA regulation. So trying to avoid some of the gray areas, I think, are where you need to think about how you make these claims and how you steer clear of FDA scrutiny.
So can we talk about that gray area a little bit? Because there is almost an implied level of importance to wellness data and things. It's almost like you can sell people the vision of the tracking your data, wellness, et cetera, but it's almost kind of right at the end where you can say, well, but these aren't actually meant to be diagnostic of anything. So I think there's a slight gray area there where you can try and convince people that it's useful and that it's valuable, but you also have to have the disclaimer that this isn't the actual data that your physician can rely on. And I would hope that we would get to the point where I don't want to say that disclaimer is no longer necessary, but that the data that we're talking about is actually at a grade where a physician can rely on it. Ultimately, I'd like to think that that's the hope that we get there someday.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The guidances that have been released trying to clarify what is squarely a wellness product, what is potentially a medical device, but falling into, an enforcement discretion, lower risk framework, and then what really is the focus of regulatory oversight has been a topic of discussion for I think a couple of years now. And where I think increasingly the agency is comfortable with statements that having access to certain types of health information that enables you to, again, live well with a disease state is not going to be a focus of regulatory oversight, right? That whether or not they're definitively classifying certain statements as medical device claims or not, I think sometimes falls into a bit of a gray zone, but I think the posturing of the agency is that these lower risk claims are appropriate. If you're collecting known parameters that have, again, sort of known constructs of interpretation and are used in a very valid way for fitness or wellness purposes, I think the agency is not focusing on enforcement of particular regulatory paradigms around those claims, where we get into those kinds of population screening types of claims. I think we have seen the agency say, you know, I do want to take a look at this. These are new technologies. I do think that the, you know, analytical validity, the clinical validity needs to be examined in a pre-market context. And then we've seen the agency also talk about the importance of transparency in degree of regulation, that if this is effectively a black box sort of technology where, you know, the patient doesn't necessarily understand how input gets to output, the physician doesn't necessarily understand, then that's definitely a type of technology that, in order to rely upon in a diagnostic capacity, there does need to be more evaluation.
Yeah. And we have a question from the audience that brings us to really kind of the fourth, you know, element here, which is big data and consent, right? So in addition to doctors and patients, there are other companies, other firms that would love access to this kind of information. So the question is, you know, if you want to participate, if you, I believe, as a patient, want to participate in big data, what kind of consent do you need? And what are the considerations? So I guess this is from the company side. So if you're a company and you want to actually participate in the big data landscape, what kind of consent do you need? And what are the kind of considerations that you think about to either sell subscriptions or to kind of go after things for reimbursement? So what are some of the big parameters around that?
Well, I think in terms of consent, there are a number of things to think about. So we talked about transparency as it relates to FDA, but transparency as it relates to FTC and attorneys general is critically important in this context too, because we've seen enforcement actions here in New York in the last 5-6 years. We've seen enforcement actions at the FTC vantage point as well, where it depends on what it is that you want to do and who you want to share the information with. And transparency really is key. So in terms of the kinds of consents that you need, your privacy statement has to be really clear. You may need to have particular checkbox consents, and that depends in some part on what states require. So again, talking about best practices, to the extent that you want to do this across the country and gather information from patients and create a large database to share, then you may in certain instances need to obtain consent through your privacy policy, typically, for the purpose of sharing that information. And you have to be really transparent about how you're going to do it and what it is that you're going to do. How long you're going to store the information is also a component requiring consent in certain instances with respect to certain states. So I guess, you know, rule of thumb is don't put a generic privacy statement on your product or on your website. That's a bad idea.
That's free advice from Linda.
Yeah.
So the consents really come into play depending on what you're collecting in terms of information points and who you're sharing it with and for what purpose.
I would just add to that by saying, you know, circling back to that question of, you know, is at-home testing here to stay? Have we, you know, gotten people more comfortable with these modalities of data collection and data sharing? That component of trust and consent is essential to reinforcing this paradigm, right? I think that patients are aware of and sensitive to you know, breaches that they've read about in the news, you know, companies who have been skirting that line of you know, having pretty generic privacy policies that aren't explicitly saying how data will be shared, how data will be used, whether data will be de-identified. And so I think that's a critical component for industry to collectively set up and adhere to standards around this to make sure that we're promoting patient trust.
So I'll ask a little bit of a maybe not an odd question here, but are we reaching all of the right people with at-home testing? Do you see disparities in the kinds of patients that we're reaching? And do you think we could do a better job of, maybe reaching a more or a broader or more diverse set of patients? I realize on the wellness side, a lot of people like to start with people that are, fitness enthusiasts, right? But, how do you see us being able to reach, patients, everywhere, and break down some of the barriers to have kind of a more, I guess, equitable spread of at-home testing?
I think it's a great question. From my perspective, I think, while certainly fitness trackers and wearables aren't ubiquitous right now, smartphone use is quite prevalent, at least across the US population. And I think there have been very appropriate concerns raised about whether that would be a barrier to entry, whether we'd be able to reach, sort of a full range of demographics. If there is this limiting factor of technology literacy and comfort with new types of technology. I think we've seen that the increasing acceptance across a variety of demographic groups, but I think there are still real concerns around some degree of technology literacy, but then also about price points and affordability, right? And I think that's an area where we really need to focus, and that's where some of these conversations around reimbursement pathways come back to the forefront, right? If we have clear ways for people to be able to access this technology that they know will be eligible for reimbursement, or if employers or other social constructs are offering or subsidizing some of these data collection technologies, I think that we will then move into a position where we're enabling access for a broader range of populations who would really benefit from that construct.
Yeah, I think that is a really great question. And I think the cost piece of it is critically important in terms of access. So what we've seen with companies that are trying very purposefully to have a very broad reach of their product is that the cost piece of it is sort of critical, I think, in terms of accessibility. Marissa's absolutely right. I think smartphone use is ubiquitous. So to the extent that a technology can be used through the smartphone, privacy and security issues taken into account as well, of course, the cost component and making it accessible from that standpoint, I think goes a long way towards inclusiveness.
And is there any deviation from an equity standpoint, making something available really only to order online versus in your local stores? I believe, based on just my cursory looking at my local drugstore shelves, that Everly sells both in store as well as an online platform.
We do, yes. We have both retail locations and the online product platform as well. And I do think that certainly helps. There is the kind of last mile of care delivery and being able to have people access care options through a variety of particular localities. I think a lot of people are comfortable with online platforms, but certainly for some demographics, visiting the pharmacy, potentially even embedded in a doctor's practice or a health system, right? Having accessibility to new kinds of testing technologies in a familiar location also helps to normalize and to provide more access.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great point. I'm glad you hit that, where different groups of people get their healthcare and get their information from different places. And establishing trust in the places that people are used to getting their healthcare from is really paramount in this, because if patients aren't comfortable with something, they're not going to do it. And building that trust and getting them comfortable with kind of new ways of getting their healthcare, I think, is something that we're going to see emerging more and more. So this has been great. We have a minute left. Why don't I give both of you kind of 30 seconds for the last lightning round? Give us 1 point to end on. Linda, why don't you go first?
Well, I think the point to end on is that utilizing these kinds of technologies is both important, but the pathway towards getting there is really exciting. So for companies that are considering it, I would encourage it. I think we're really seeing a new realm of what is possible. So it's an exciting time to be doing this.
All right, and Marisa, you can wrap us up here, and we can't thank you enough for joining from the West Coast this morning.
No, it was great to be here. Yes, I would definitely echo Linda's enthusiasm about this space. I think Everly Health and similar companies are forging new ground and making sure that at-home testing modalities are accessible and affordable for as broad a range of populations as possible. And I think there's a lot of excitement around how those linkages that we've talked about in this conversation, making sure that we have technology that's really augmenting healthcare delivery, traditional and new delivery models in this country. I think the excitement around that is real, is building, is accelerated by COVID, but I think the path forward is bright.
Thank you. Thank you both. And we look forward to maybe having you back this time next year to see in 1 year what advances have been made in the industry. All right, everyone, have a good day. Thank you.
You too. Bye, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.